Welcome, everyone, to Easy History Podcast. Today, we're going to take in a deep dive into a period that still shapes our world today in countless ways, the Cold War. Now, you might think Cold War sounds kind of boring, but trust me, it was anything but. It's a story full of spies, near-apocalyptic showdowns, and
Well,
even a little ping-pong diplomacy.
it really is fascinating how this era, despite never erupting into a full-scale hot war, managed to dominate global politics for nearly half a century. The tension, the mistrust, the constant threat of nuclear annihilation. It's like something out of a spy thriller, but with real-world consequences.
Exactly. So, let's rewind a bit. World War II ends in 1945. Everyone's hoping for peace, right? But instead, this new kind of conflict emerges. The U.S. and the Soviet Union, former allies, suddenly facing off as superpowers with very different visions for the future.
Yeah, the seeds of this conflict. They were sown even before the victory parades ended. Think about it. You have the U.S. championing democracy and capitalism, and the USSR promoting a communist system with the state controlling everything. It was a clash of ideologies, a fundamental disagreement about how society should be organized.
And remember, both sides had just emerged from a devastating global war. They were exhausted but also armed to the teeth and deeply suspicious of each other's motives. So instead of peace, we got this Cold War, a global chess match with incredibly high stakes.
And that chessboard, it wasn't limited to just one continent. Europe, of course, was at the heart of it, divided by what Winston Churchill famously called the Iron Curtain. But the Cold War's icy grip extended to Asia, the Middle East, Latin America, anywhere these competing ideologies clash for influence.
It's almost like the world was holding its breath, waiting to see which way the dominoes would fall. So where do we even begin with this tangled web of events? What were some of the early moves that really set the stage for the Cold War?
Well, early on, the U.S. adopted a policy called the Truman Doctrine. Essentially, this meant containing communism, preventing it from spreading any further. They started by providing economic and military aid to Greece and Turkey, countries seen as vulnerable to Soviet influence. It was the first step in a much larger strategy of global intervention.
So the U.S. is taking a proactive approach, almost like drawing a line in the sand and saying no further. But it wasn't just about military might, right? They also tried to rebuild Europe with the Marshall Plan, this massive economic aid program.
Exactly. It was a brilliant, albeit controversial move. The U.S. pumped billions of dollars into rebuilding war-torn European economies. The idea was that prosperity would act as a shield against communism. It strengthened Western alliances and presented a stark contrast to the struggling economies within the Soviet sphere of influence.
It's almost like two competing models of development being offered, and each side trying to win over hearts and minds, not just territory. But then there's Germany, right? Literally divided into a physical manifestation of this ideological split.
Germany became a microcosm of the Cold War. The Berlin blockade and airlift in 1948-49 was a particularly tense standoff. The Soviets tried to cut off West Berlin, and the U.S. responded with this incredible airlift, supplying the city entirely by air for almost a year.
I remember learning about those pilots, risking their lives every day to bring food, medicine, even coal to West Berlin. It really highlights how determined each side was, how far they were willing to go.
And these tensions, they weren't just playing out in symbolic gestures. The Cold War quickly escalated into an arms race, with both sides developing and testing increasingly powerful nuclear weapons. The stakes were terrifyingly high.
I can't even imagine what it must have been like living under that constant shadow of nuclear annihilation, the development of the hydrogen bomb. Even more powerful than the atomic bombs used in World War II. Must have been absolutely chilling.
The fear was very real. People were building bomb shelters, practicing duck and cover drills in schools. The world truly was holding its breath, wondering if this rivalry would escalate into something catastrophic. And then in 1962, that fear almost became reality with the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Okay, here's where things get really intense. Soviet missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from U.S. shores. It's like something straight out of a Cold War thriller, except this time the world might actually end.
It really was a standoff for the ages. President Kennedy and Soviet Premier Khrushchev, two incredibly powerful leaders, locked in this high-stakes game of nuclear chicken. The world watched and waited as they negotiated a solution that, thankfully, pulled us back from the brink of war.
But even with that crisis averted, the tensions didn't just disappear. The Cold War was far from over. It continued to play out in proxy wars, like the long and bloody conflict in Vietnam. It was a war that deeply divided the U.S., sparked massive protests at home, and ultimately ended in a U.S. withdrawal.
The Vietnam War was a turning point for many. It showed the limits of U.S. power. the complexities of these ideological conflicts, and the human costs of the Cold War. It also highlighted the role of media in shaping public perception. The images coming out of Vietnam, broadcast directly into people's homes, they had a profound impact on public opinion.
It's hard to imagine now in our age of instant information what it must have been like to see those images for the first time, to realize the brutal reality of war unfolding on the other side of the world. It must have felt both shocking and deeply unsettling.
And while the Vietnam War raged, another drama was unfolding. The Cold War rivalry also fueled a race to space, a competition for technological supremacy that captivated the world. Think about it.
Right.
Sputnik, the first artificial satellite, launched by the Soviets in 1957, sent shockwaves through the U.S. It was a wake-up call, a realization that they were falling behind in this crucial area.
And that sparked a frenzy of innovation, right? The U.S. poured resources into its space program, determined to catch up and surpass the Soviets. It was a race that ultimately culminated in the Apollo 11 mission and Neil Armstrong's historic first steps on the moon in 1969.
It was an incredible achievement, a testament to human ingenuity and the power of ambition. But it's important to remember that the space race, it was also deeply intertwined with Cold War anxieties and the desire to project power on a global stage. It wasn't just about science and exploration, it was about national pride and ideological dominance.
It's fascinating how even something as seemingly positive as space exploration was so deeply entangled with this underlying conflict. But it wasn't just about rockets and moon landings, was it? The Cold War also had a profound impact on culture, on the way people lived, thought, and even dreamed.
Absolutely. The Cold War was a time of intense anxiety, but also of creativity and innovation. It permeated popular culture, influencing everything from music and film to fashion and literature. Think about the spy thrillers, the dystopian novels, the music that reflected the fears and hopes of that era.
It's like the Cold War seeped into every corner of society, shaping the way people saw the world and their place in it. But while we've been talking a lot about the U.S. and the Soviet Union, it's important to remember that the Cold War wasn't just a bipolar conflict. Other countries, other ideologies also played a significant role in shaping this era.
That's right. The Cold War was a global phenomenon with multiple players and complex dynamics. The rise of communist China in 1949, for instance, was a major turning point. It created a new communist superpower. That eventually challenged the Soviet Union for leadership of the communist world.
So even within the communist bloc, there were tensions and rivalries. It wasn't a monolithic entity, as many in the West often perceived it to be. And then there was the Middle East, right? Another region where the Cold War played out in complex and often dangerous ways.
The Middle East was a battleground for influence, with both the U.S. and the USSR vying for control of this strategically important region. The Suez Crisis in 1956, the Arab-Israeli conflicts, the rise of nationalism and Islamic fundamentalism, all of these developments were influenced by the Cold War dynamics. It was a tangled web of alliances, rivalries, and proxy conflicts, with the superpowers often playing a destabilizing role.
It's almost like the Cold War exacerbated existing tensions and created new ones,
Yeah.
making an already volatile region even more unstable. And then there was Latin America, another hotbed of Cold War intrigue.
Latin America became a focal point for U.S. efforts to contain communism. The Cuban Revolution in 1959, led by Fidel Castro, was a major blow to U.S. interests in the region. It led to the Bay of Pigs invasion, a failed attempt to overthrow Castro. And of course, the Cuban Missile Crisis, which brought the world to the brink of nuclear war.
It seems like everywhere you look during this era, there's a Cold War connection, some way in which this rivalry between superpowers is influencing events, shaping decisions, and creating a climate of fear and uncertainty. It's really remarkable how pervasive it was.
It's a testament to how deeply this ideological struggle impacted global politics, economics, and even culture. But it's also important to remember that the Cold War wasn't static. It evolved over time, went through periods of thaw and frost, of confrontation and cooperation.
So it wasn't just a constant state of high alert of imminent nuclear threat. There were moments of hope, glimmers of possibility for a different kind of future.
Exactly. After Stalin's death in 1953, there was a brief period of de-Stalinization in the Soviet Union, a slight easing of tensions known as the Khrushchev thaw. But events like the Hungarian uprising in 1956, brutally suppressed by the Soviets, showed the limits of this thaw and the enduring nature of the Cold War divide.
It's like a dance between two wary partners, taking a step forward, then two steps back, never quite sure if they can trust each other enough to let go of their defenses.
And then in the 1970s, we see a period of détente, a deliberate easing of tensions between the U.S. and the USSR. There were arms control talks agreements signed, and a sense that perhaps, just Perhaps these two superpowers could find a way to coexist peacefully.
It must have felt like a breath of fresh air after decades of tension and mistrust, a chance, however fragile, to step back from the abyss.
But détente was short-lived. Under President Reagan in the 1980s, there was a renewed hardline stance against the USSR, a massive military buildup, and a resurgence of Cold War tensions. It was a time of renewed anxiety, of fears that the world might be slipping back into a dangerous confrontation.
It's almost as if history is repeating itself, this cycle of hope and fear, of progress and setback. But even as the Reagan administration was taking a more confrontational approach, something else was happening within the Soviet Union itself. Change was brewing.
That's right. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in the Soviet Union, and he ushered in a period of dramatic change. He introduced reforms like perestroika, which aimed to restructure the Soviet economy, and glasnost, which promoted openness and transparency. His goal was to revitalize the struggling Soviet system. But these reforms unintentionally contributed to its eventual collapse.
It's almost ironic, isn't it? The attempt to save the Soviet Union from within actually hastened its demise. And these internal pressures, combined with growing unrest in Eastern Europe, created a perfect storm that led to the fall of the Iron Curtain.
Exactly. The Cold War was entering its final act, and the world was about to witness some of the most dramatic events of the 20th century.
So we're talking about the final act of the Cold War. What were some of those key events that led to the fall of the Iron Curtain?
Well, one of the first cracks appeared in Poland with the rise of the Solidarity movement, a massive trade union that challenged the communist government's authority. They weren't just demanding better working conditions. They were demanding political reforms, freedom of speech, basic human rights.
It's incredible to think about the courage it must have taken to stand up to a totalitarian regime like that. And Solidarity wasn't just a small group of dissidents. It was a mass movement. Millions of people united in their desire for change.
Exactly. And their struggle inspired others across the Soviet bloc. It showed that change was possible, that even the most rigid, seemingly unbreakable regimes could be challenged from within. And then, in 1989, the most powerful symbol of that change came crashing down, the Berlin Wall.
That must have been an absolutely electrifying moment. For decades, that wall had stood as a concrete barrier between East and West, a physical embodiment of the Cold War divide. And then almost overnight, it was gone. People were chipping away at it with hammers and pickaxes, celebrating their newfound freedom.
It was a moment of pure joy and liberation, a testament to the human desire for freedom and the power of peaceful protest. And it signaled the beginning of the end for the Soviet bloc. Democratic revolutions swept across Eastern Europe, one after another. Communist regimes crumbled, and people finally tasted freedom after decades of oppression.
It's almost hard to believe how quickly it all unfolded. It's like the entire world was holding its breath, and then suddenly this collective exhale of relief and jubilation. But the story doesn't end there, does it? The Soviet Union itself was still standing, at least for a little while longer.
That's right. The fall of the Berlin Wall was a decisive blow, but the Soviet Union itself was facing mounting internal and external pressures. Gorbachev's reforms had unleashed forces he couldn't control, and the empire was crumbling from within. And then, in December of 1991, the unthinkable happened. The Soviet Union dissolved, marking a definitive end to the Cold War.
It's almost hard to wrap our minds around such a momentous event, this decades-long rivalry, this global struggle that shaped the lives of millions just over. It must have felt like an entirely new world was emerging, full of possibilities, but also uncertainties.
It was a time of profound change, a historical turning point that continues to shape our world today. The Cold War may be over, but its legacy is complex and multifaceted. It left us with a world reshaped by ideological battles, technological advancements, and the lingering threat of nuclear weapons.
So what can we learn from this era? What insights can we glean from this deep dive into the Cold War? That might help us navigate the challenges of our own time.
I think one of the most important takeaways is the understanding that even seemingly intractable conflicts can end. The Cold War was a time of intense rivalry, of near-apocalyptic showdowns, but it ultimately ended peacefully. That's a testament to the power of diplomacy, the importance of communication, and the willingness to find common ground even with those we deeply disagree with.
It's a reminder that dialogue, however difficult, is always preferable to confrontation, and that even in the darkest of times, we should never give up hope for a better future. The Cold War also taught us about the human cost of ideological conflicts, the dangers of unchecked power, and the importance of safeguarding individual liberties and human rights.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that freedom is precious, that it must be constantly defended, and that we must always be vigilant against any form of tyranny. whether it comes from the left or the right. The Cold War also showed us the power of human resilience, the ability to endure hardship, to resist oppression, and to strive for a better world.
It's inspiring to think about all those individuals, those ordinary people who lived through those extraordinary times, who faced down fear and uncertainty, who fought for their beliefs, and who ultimately helped to bring about a more peaceful and hopeful future.
And as we wrap up this deep dive into the Cold War, I think it's important to remember that history is not just something we read about in textbooks. It's a living, breathing story that continues to shape our world today, and the lessons we learn from it can help us navigate the challenges of our own time and build a future that is just more peaceful and more hopeful.
That's a great point. The Cold War might be over, but its echoes can still be heard in the geopolitical tensions, the ideological battles, and the technological advancements that define our world today. By understanding this crucial period of history, we can better understand ourselves and the forces that shape our lives. And hopefully we can use that knowledge to build a better future, one where the mistakes of the past are not repeated, and where the human spirit continues to triumph over adversity. Thanks for joining us in this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep questioning.